Just mention briefly before we get started in the lesson this morning, I hate the fact that it's going to be about 3 weeks before we get back to the book of Job. So be sure to mark where we're at. I'm going to be gone for the next 2 weeks. Brother Joe is going to preach on something else during this Bible class period. Next week, we'll be gone for Gracie's surgery. The next week, I'm still working on lining that out. I'll be gone in a gospel meeting to Mountain Home and won't be here. Then the next week is our gospel meeting, and Brother Brett Mohair will be preaching to us during the class period. So it'll actually be a period of about 3 weeks before I'm back to teach the class, and so I know that's quite a gap, but just keep that in mind. That's one reason there's not an outline in the back for next week. I'll wait and put it out as we get closer to it so that everybody has those in hand. We've been in the book of Job, and we've noted in the book of Job each and every week that we have this basic outline of Job that is the prologue in chapters 1 and 2, the dialogue in 3 to 42, and then the epilogue in 42 through the end of the chapter. We are in the midst of those three cycles of speeches. If you look right here, this is the exchange between Job and his friends, starting in chapter 4 and going through chapter 27, and we're in the midst of that section in our discussion right now. We talked about chapter 22 last week, where Eliphaz had spoken to Job and had really pointed out to Job, you're not suffering because you're righteous. You're suffering because of your sin. You think you can hide things from God, and you can hide things from God. He knows what you're guilty of, and he exhorts him to repent. And really for the first time, Job's friends had made some specific accusations against Job. Now, the accusations they made were without foundation. It's easy to make an accusation. You're an adulterer. I can make it. That doesn't make it what? Doesn't make it true. You're a liar. Accusations are easy to make, and that's what they're doing. They're throwing these at Job because they don't have anything specific that they can point to. The best they can do is to sort of speculate. Job, you're rich. Since you're rich, you must have gotten rich by taking advantage of the poor and oppressing other people. That's the sin that you're guilty of. So Job responds in 23 through 25, and he begins by saying that God is inaccessible in reality, is what he says. He says, beginning in verse 1 of chapter 23, he points out that even today my complaint is bitter and my hand is listless because of my groaning. Job admits that what I'm saying sounds bitter. In fact, that's probably better translated. That word bitter is translated in the New American Standard Translation, my complaint is rebellion. Every other time that phrase or that word is used in the Old Testament, in the New King James, it is translated by the word rebellion. And I think Job realized, I'm walking a line. In fact, I'm crossing a line in what I'm saying about God, but you don't understand what I'm going through, and that my hand is listless because of my groaning. It's heavy. It's a burden I can't bear. In verses 3 through down through about verse 6, he said, if I could find God and present my case to him, I know I would be acquitted. In fact, if I knew where to find him, in verse 3, I'd come to his judgment seat. And then I would present my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. And so if I could just find God and approach God, I'd go to his mercy seat, I'd present my case before the Lord, and I know the words with which he would answer me, and I understand what he would say to me. And the idea seems to be that what God would do in verse 6 is he wouldn't contend with me. He'd take note of me, though, because if I could present my case to God, God would see my side of things, and God would acquit me. But Job says the problem is in 8 to 9 what? I can't find him. I look and I go forward, but he's not there, and backward, but I cannot perceive him. In other words, no matter where I turn, to the left hand or the right hand in verse 9, I can't find God. I can't present my case before him. Really, in reality, I think what Job is saying is God is not listening to what I'm having to say, but if he would just listen and I could present my case, I know that he would acquit me. Because God knows in verse 10 the way that I take. He knows what kind of person I am. He knows my righteousness, And when he has tested me, I shall come forth as gold. This is interesting because for the first time in the book of Job, either on the part of Job's friends or the part of Job, Job's suffering has been introduced perhaps as a test by God. The friends have viewed it as punishment. Job has talked about it being unjust, but now for the first time he talks about being tested. And when all this testing is done, I'm going to come forth on the other side, and I'm going to be proven to be pure gold. It reminds me of the passage in 1 Peter chapter 1 that talks about the genuineness of your faith being more precious than gold that perishes, though it be tried by fire, may be found to praise, honor, and glory at the revelation of Jesus Christ. And so Job does seem to be, in my mind, thinking through things as he is making his arguments and as he's dealing with suffering. And Job, he's not there yet, but he's beginning to grasp maybe a little bit more that maybe this isn't punishment. Maybe it is just simply a test that God has placed upon me, and I'm going to come forth, and I am going to come forth as gold. And the reason I am in 11 to 12 is because I have held fast to his steps. Look at what Job said. Even in the midst of all of Job's complaints, Job said, I've held fast to his steps, I've kept his way, I've not departed from his commandments, and I treasured his words of his mouth more than my necessary food. And so Job said, I've remained faithful to God. By the way, if you want to learn exactly why it is, I'm hitting this in my pocket there. If you want to know why it is that Job comes forth as gold ultimately, it's because apparently he still continued to feed upon the revelation of God. Even in the midst of these trials, he said, I desired it more than I desired my necessary food. But then in 13 to 17, he points out that God is unique. And God is unique in that God does what God wants to do. Who's going to tell God what? Anything. Who can make him change? You know, as a parent, you might tell your child, you're not going to do that anymore. That's the end of that. You're going to stop that. Maybe your boss at work could tell you, who can tell God what? Stop. You're going to change. You're not going to do. Nobody can. So if you wanted to sum up really all of verses 13 to verse 17, really what he's saying is God does what God wants to do, and nobody can stop the Lord from doing it. And therefore I'm terrified at his presence, and when I consider this, I am afraid of him. Because I cannot stop God from doing what he's doing, and at this point in time, he is viewing God as sort of using him still as target practice. Now, in chapter 24 now, Job comes back to this idea of the wicked not being punished. And Job's argument, again, I said in the beginning that Job's initial speeches are sort of scattered. They're all over the place. There's no organization. It does seem that as we get further into the book of Job, Job's argumentation becomes tighter. In fact, it seems that he narrows his argumentation down really to refute the friends to two main points. Look, there's wicked people all around us. They're not being punished right now. And there are wicked people that are prospering, and so your whole argumentation fails. And it's interesting that the friends never even address that argument. They never come back and say, Job, here's the evidence that you're wrong. They just ignore it completely. But in verses 1 to 17, the wicked are not punished now. And that's key, now. Job is going to admit they're going to be punished, but it's not always immediate. Why does God not appoint the time of punishment for evil? Verse 1, since times are not hidden from the Almighty, why do those who know him not see his days? In other words, it really seems to be saying, why is there not a day where God just punishes the wicked in a way that everybody what? Everybody sees and recognizes there's no value in wickedness. But there is no such day. In fact, seemingly, they're guilty of all kinds of sin, and they get off, it looks like, at least immediately scot-free. There are people that remove landmarks in verse 2. They take away the donkey of the fatherless. They push the needy people off the road. They glean in the vineyard of the wicked in verse 6. They spend the night naked without clothing and with no covering, and the cold seem to be taking advantage of the needy. They snatch the fatherless from the breast. Really what he's describing all the way through here, down to about verse 13 and 14 is that these are the sins that they're guilty of, and yet seemingly in verse 17, in the morning is the same to them as the shadow of death. In other words, there seems to be no consequence to what they're doing. They're not being punished right now. And really, I think Job is, again, coming back to an argumentation he made in the last speech, which is, listen, Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, look around. You see any wicked people around? You know, they're not going through what I'm going through. They're not enduring the suffering that I'm going through right now. In fact, they seem to be doing pretty well. Therefore, wickedness is not always punished now. But Job really seems to come back to his friends and to say, but I'm not saying that wickedness is not ever going to be punished. Look at what he says in verse 18. They should be swift on the face of the waters. In other words, like the foam on the waters that's driven away. As drought and heat consume the snow waters, so the grave consumes those that sinned. And he goes on and talks about what God is going to do to the wicked. And it's sort of summed up in verse 24. Listen. They're exalted for a little while, but what? Then they're gone. They are brought low. They're taken out of the way like all others, and they dry out like the heads of grain. So if you put Job's argumentation together, really what Job is saying is, if God would listen to me, I would be acquitted. I'm innocent. I know I'm innocent. God knows I'm innocent, and you're charging me with things that are not true. The wicked aren't always punished now. Your argument is that the wicked are punished and the righteous are rewarded. It doesn't stand up to investigation because the wicked are prospering right now. But I'm not saying that God's never going to punish the wicked. In fact, they may prosper for a little while, but eventually they're going to be punished. As Job's argumentation is sort of tightening up, he's beginning to reason through things. He's not going to get there completely until God speaks to him, but he is coming closer to a realization that maybe I'm being tested and maybe this is temporary. Bildad in chapter 25. Well, what's the first thing you notice when you look at Bildad's speech in chapter 25? First thing that jumps off the page to you about it. It's short. The friends, it seems, are getting shorter with Job. They don't address the argument that he makes. It may be that the friends are sort of coming to the point that we're not convincing you, you're not convincing us, this is a waste of time. Because Bildad, his speech is a total of 6 verses. How long is Zophar's third speech? He doesn't even deliver one. Zophar doesn't even speak a third time. So it seems that the friends are sort of getting exasperated with Job, and they're winding down. And Bildad's speech really could be summed up in this way. God is awesome and great, and in comparison to God, man is nothing. And the point is, when Bildad is through with his speech, you know what Job could have said to that? So? What does that mean? I mean, I'm willing to grant that. What does that prove? Here's the problem. He begins in verse 1 by saying, dominion and fear belong to him. He makes peace in his high places. Is there any number to his armies? Upon whom does he light and not rise? In other words, God is in control. This may be a response back to Job's accusation that God is not accessible, God is not listening, but God is the one that is in control. In fact, he has, there's no number to his armies. There is no place where his light does not rise. Can man be righteous before God? Perfectly so, never sin. I think that seems to be Bildad's point. And the answer is no. In fact, it's really a poetic description, by the way, of God's greatness and man's insignificance. Even to the point that he says in verse 5, the moon does not shine and the stars are not pure in his sight. I think that's saying, in comparison to the glory of God, the stars and the moon are what? They're nothing. In fact, comparison to the glory of God, the moon doesn't even give light. It's poetic language describing and exalting the greatness of God in comparison to man and to God's creation. And then in verse 6, he said, how much less man who is a maggot and the son of man who is a worm. And as in comparison to God, what are we? We're nothing. We're nothing. I mean, there's maggots and worms. I don't know if you get any lower than maggots and worms on the in terms of creation. And the point is, again, don't take this literally. Some have tried to be very critical of what Bildad has to say here. I think all Bildad is saying is, in comparison to God, you know what I am? I'm a maggot. I am a worm. I'm nothing in comparison to God. What's the problem with Bildad's argumentation? Really two things, I would say. Number one, does that apply to Bildad and Eliphaz and Zophar just as much as it applies to Job? You know, oftentimes when somebody's defending a false concept, they end up proving more than they want to prove. And in this particular case, man can't be righteous. Man is just a maggot, Job. That's why all this is happening to you. Well, all right, Bildad, what are you in comparison to God? What about Eliphaz? What about Zophar? So in his argumentation, he would have encompassed them as well. The second thing that's wrong with it, I've been in religious discussions with people before, and you make an argument, and people come back and they say something, but they never address what? What you've said. They never answer that argument. The argument about wicked people right now, they're all around us and they're prospering. What is Bill? He doesn't touch backside, top side, or bottom of that argument. He just seemingly ignores that, as had Eliphaz and Zophar's not even going to say anything. So Bildad's speech is relatively short, and now Job comes back in 26 to 27, and he responds. And by the way, I think all parties involved are probably getting a little bit irritated with one another by this point in time. And Job answered and said to him, how have you helped him who is without power? Depending on your translation, if you look at the New King James, I think the Old King James too, it has it as question marks. How, in other words, he would be asking this question, how have you helped him that's without power? How have you armed the one that has no strength? Most translations, and this seems to be better, translates that as an emphatic. And there's sarcasm on Job's part. He's not asking a question, but, oh, how you have helped him that's without power. It's like Job saying, you ever said to somebody, oh, that was really valuable. Man, you really helped me out. Oh, you've counseled. Oh, how you've given counsel to the one that didn't have wisdom, and oh, how you have declared sound advice to many. So, if your translation has that as an emphatic with an exclamation mark after it, what Job is doing is he's being sarcastic into them, and they would have got that. You know, I always say this: one of the things that's hard in the Bible. If I had to compare it to that, I'd compare it to texting. I always tell people when somebody texts, you read it with whatever tone you want to. And it can completely change the meaning of something. You know, when we're speaking in person, I can generally tell sarcasm from somebody. You can tell in the tone of their voice. You can tell by how they're acting. Sometimes in the Bible uses sarcasm. And I think this is the case, that if you could hear the tone in Job's voice, he's indicating your help is what? Worthless. Oh, man, that was. Oh, Bill, that's good stuff there. You've really given wisdom to somebody. Man, I have learned so much from you, Bildad. Well, then in verse 4, to whom have you uttered words, and whose spirit came from you? I think Job is probably saying, when he said, to whom have you uttered words, Job is probably saying, whose arguments are you answering anyway? You haven't responded what? To me. You're not speaking to me. Just exactly who are you answering? Then, after having pointed out in verses 1 to verse 4, Job turns to talk about the power of God. As if he is admitting to Bildad, I realize God's power. I realize the greatness of God. The dead tremble, those under the water and those inhabiting them. Sheol is naked before him, and destruction has no covering. What does God see? Everything. Even to the depths, even in Sheol. It reminds me of Psalm 139, where the psalmist points out, you know, if I could go to the highest mountain, you're there. If I could go down to the very depths of the sea, you're there. Job is saying, you know what? He sees those in Sheol. To say that he sees those in Sheol is just to say God sees in the darkness as well as in the light. He sees the dead as well as the living. God, nothing is hidden from the Lord. He sees everything. Not only that, in 7 to 14, he creates and he controls the world. He stretches out the north over the empty place, and he hangs the earth on nothing. In other words, here the earth is in its rotation. It's not hung on anything, and yet it stands right in its place and rotates at just the right speed. Why does it do that? Who's in control? God. He's the one that put it there. He covers the face of his throne and spreads his cloud over it. Talks about the horizon over the face of the water. He stirs up the sea with his power in verse 12. By his understanding, he breaks up the storm. The whole point of all of this is that God is powerful. He sees everything, and God controls the world. It's really his essence of which he's saying to Bildad. I don't know who you're answering, because when you talk about God being great and man being small, you know what I can say that Job said? I say amen to that. I agree with that. But that's not what I'm saying, and you're not addressing anything that I have presented to you. That really marks, if you look at the first part of chapter 27, I know I've got it in one outline. If you look in the outline, in the first verse of verse 27, it seems that this is the place where Zophar would have spoken. In fact, you might mark in your margin of your Bible, and I have in mind my electronic Bibles and others, mark out before verse 1 of chapter 27 and say Zophar is silent. Okay? Because we've had these three friends. Eliphaz speaks, Job responds. Bildad speaks, Job responds. Zophar speaks, Job responds. We've gone through that through 2 cycles. Now we're into the 3rd cycle, and we have Eliphaz, Job responds to him. Bildad barely speaks, 6 verses, and then Job responds to him. But the way verse 1 of chapter 27 is recorded, moreover, Job continued his discourse. Most agree that it's probably at that point in time, Job sort of turned to Zophar, and Zophar didn't have anything to say, so Job, what? He just continued on. Why didn't Zophar speak? You'll have to speculate about that. Maybe he thought he had nothing more to say to it. Maybe he just said, you know what, Job, I'm wasting my breath. If I talk to you, you're not going to listen. Whatever the reason was, Zophar doesn't speak, and then Job continues on. And Job again declares his innocence in verses 1 through verse 6. As God lives, who has taken away my justice, and the Almighty, who has made my soul bitter, as long as my breath is in me, and the breath of God in my nostrils, my lips will not speak wickedness, nor my tongue utter deceit. Far be it from me that I should say you are right. Till I die, I will not put away my integrity from me. It's as if they're pushing Job to admit he's wrong, and Job still is taking some barbs at God in that, God's made me bitter, God's the one behind this. But Job says, to the day I die, I'm not admitting I'm wrong just to satisfy you. I'm not going to do that. It's sort of like, it reminds me one time I had a place called me and said that a check had bounced that I had written. And it was in a place I'd never been. But somehow on a bank account I didn't have. But somehow my driver's license number was on it. But I remember the guy on the phone, I said, I'm not paying. He said, it'd be, just go ahead and just take it. Just go ahead and say it's yours, go ahead and pay it, and it'd be a lot easier. And I said, no, it's a principle, and I'm not going to do that. The friends are telling Job, just admit you're wrong. And I think what Job is saying is, no, there's a principle involved here. I'm not admitting I'm wrong just to satisfy you. In fact, till the day I die, I'm going to hold fast to my integrity, and far be it from me that I'm going to tell that you're right. I'm not going to admit I'm wrong when I haven't done anything. And so that's what Job is saying in verses 1 through verse 4. My tongue is not going to speak wickedness, and I'm not going to admit you're wrong. I'm going to hold fast to my integrity. I want my enemies to be as the wicked. Verse 7 through verse 23 is really 27, beginning at chapter 27 and verse 13, all the way through chapter 28. There's some debate among commentators as to who says this. Some have argued that even though the text doesn't say this is Zophar speaking, but there's no indication of that at all, that this is Zophar speaking. Well, one reason for that is, if you didn't have the book of Job like you've got right now, and I was to take out of this context, particularly verses 13 through the end of the chapter, and I was to just say, we was playing Bible trivia, and I said, in the book of Job, who says this? I'd be surprised if you don't read through that and say, you know what, that sounds an awful lot like Bildad. That sounds an awful lot like Zophar. Or maybe that sounds an awful lot like Eliphaz. Job sounds a lot like his three friends here in this discussion as he's sort of wrapping things up before we go into the interlude on wisdom. And there have been various explanations given of that. Some have said, well, it just shows how inconsistent Job is. He's up here, he's down there, he's all around. That might be, but I doubt that that is the case. As I said, some have attributed that to Zophar and said it's really him speaking here or one of the other friends. I think more likely what is happening is Job is telling his friends in this section, I agree with you in principle, but I disagree with your application of that principle. You know, is it possible you could agree on a principle but disagree with somebody's application of it? In other words, what if I preached a sermon and that whole sermon was really that you reap what you sow? Would you agree with that principle? Sure you would. You'd agree with that principle. But then let's say, you know, a week from now, 2 weeks from now, somebody has a car accident. Or somebody, you know, is diagnosed with some disease. And then I say, well, now there you go. You reap what you sow. Do you agree with that? Now, you can agree with the principle, but the application made of it what? That would be incorrect in that circumstance. I think Job in principle agrees with the friends. That is, wickedness is going to be punished. God is not going to overlook that. Bad things happen to wicked people, but Job is saying the principle and how you're applying it to me, what? It's not right. You're misusing that. In fact, he begins in verse 7 to 12, by saying, keep up with my time here, was saying to his friends, I want my enemies, he said, to be as the wicked, verses 7 through 12. May my enemy be like the wicked, and he who rises against me be like the unrighteous. I want them to be treated like the wicked and the unrighteous. Who do you think he has reference to? If it's not his friends, I don't have any idea who he has reference to. That's why I say it's getting a little bit what? A little bit testy, a little bit sharp between the two of them, and between the four of them. Really, when Job, in essence, I think says to them, I wish you were treated like the wicked. And he may be saying, we'll see how you respond what? Then. When it happens to you, we'll see what you say then. In fact, what he says in the next verse is, for what is the hope of the hypocrite? And again, if that's the friends that he has in mind, he's saying to you, you're nothing but what? You're nothing but a bunch of hypocrites. I don't know about you. There are a few things somebody could say to me that I'd find more insulting than to look at me and say what? You're a hypocrite. You're saying one thing, but the actions don't really match up with it. He says you're a hypocrite. Will God hear his cry when trouble comes from him? The implied answer is no. Will he delight himself in the Almighty? Will he call on God? I will teach you about the hand of God. What is with the Almighty? I will not conceal. Surely all of you have seen it. Why then do you behave with complete nonsense? And so he said, I wish you were treated like the wicked. I think in essence he's saying that do away with some of this nonsense you're talking right now. You know, I always find it easy. I've said, you know, people go through some difficulty and somebody will stand on the other side and they'll say what? This is what I would do in that circumstance. This is how I would come through. But when you're in the midst of it, it's a little bit different. And I think Job is saying, if you're treated like that, we'd see how you'd respond to that. Then in 13 through the end of the chapter. And again, this is one reason commentators have debated about that, is it sounds exactly like what the friends have said. This is the portion of the wicked man with God. This is what's going to happen to the wicked person. If his children are multiplied, what's going to happen? It's for the sword, meaning they're going to what? They're going to be taken away. His offspring are not going to be satisfied with bread. Those who survive him will be buried in death, and their widows will not weep. You know, a woman loses her husband, you expect her what? You expect her to be sad, expect her to weep. But the wicked person, I've not been there many times, but I have been there a time or two where somebody's spouse died, and the woman said, you know what? That's relief. You know, because of how that's sad. But I mean, the point is, the wicked person sometimes, it reminds me of Jehoram in the Old Testament. When he died to nobody's sorrow. That is, nobody cared to what? Let him go, because of the way that he was. He may heap up silver like dust and clothing like clay. He may pile it up, but the just will wear it, and the innocent will divide the silver. He builds his house like a moth, like a booth which a watchman makes. The rich man will lie down, but not be gathered up. He opens his eyes, and he is no more. In other words, the whole point of this section is that the wicked are going to be punished. In fact, sometimes their families suffer, the wealth is going to be enjoyed by others, and ultimately they're going to be taken away. And again, that sounds an awful lot like what the friends had been saying, but I think Job is coming around to saying, I'm not denying your principle that the wicked are going to be punished. I'm not denying that at all. I admit that that's the case, but that's not always the case immediately, right? They're not always punished right now, but eventually they will be. Any comments up to this point in time in Job's response? Let's get into chapter 28, and then we'll talk about some practical application there. Point number one, and it's there, but apparently it's in black from what I can see right here, so you can't see point number one. This is an interlude on wisdom, where, and again, it's one of those sections of Scripture that is debated. Who said this? Some say that it was added by the author, Moses, or whoever else wrote the book of Job, that it was later added. I see no reason to say that Job is not the one that is saying this at this point in time. In fact, Homer Haley said in his commentary that it was a continuation of Job's speech in chapter 27, in which he set forth the impossibility of man's reaching perfect wisdom. Searching though he may, only God has it. And he cautioned against getting bogged down in such questions to the point that we lose sight, or one commentator did, in the beauty and the truth of this point. Job may be saying in this, you think you've got wisdom, to his friends, but you know where true wisdom is found? Where? God. Do you know who only possesses true wisdom? God. And so we don't understand everything. And it may be that Job, by the way, is beginning to appreciate the fact that his viewpoint is limited. In a time of suffering, I just don't always know why God is doing what he's doing, what God has in mind. But God knows, because true wisdom abides with him. And my responsibility at the end of this chapter is to fear the Lord. And that's the lesson Job is going to even learn after God speaks to him in probably the next time that we talk. We're going to go through the speeches of Eliphaz, and then the time after that we'll talk about God approaching Job, is that I don't have to understand, but I do have to trust that God knows what he's doing. So it raises the question, where's wisdom found? Where is wisdom found? And the point seems to be that you can't search and find for it like you would search for a treasure. If I wanted silver, I could go to a mine and I could mine for silver, or a place where gold is refined. Iron is taken from the earth and copper is smelted from ore. Man puts it into darkness and searches every recess for ore in the darkness and the shadow of death. In other words, the point seems to be, as we go through this particular section, that man can go into the very depths of the earth. You ever seen places where people mine and find, whether it's ore or silver or gold? Man has searched and at great danger to find those things, and he has found them. You can find stones like sapphire. And yet, the point is, in verse 12, but where can wisdom be found? Can you search for it like you would a treasure? Could you go somewhere on the earth and find it and say, here it is? Look down at verse 14. No matter where you look, and I'm going to come back to 15 to some of these other verses in a minute, but look at verse 14. The deep says what? It's not in me, and the sea says it's not with me. In other words, you can't search on the earth and in the deep crevices and the sea or anywhere and find wisdom on your own. Man can't. It's not something you can purchase in 15 to 19. I can't say, here, take my credit card and go down to Walmart, what? Could you buy me some wisdom? If we could, we'd all go, I guess. We'd get some. It's not something you can purchase. It's not something that you can buy. In fact, it can't be valued in gold in verse 16. Gold or silver and crystal can't equal it. You can't exchange fine jewelry for it. The topaz of Ethiopia cannot equal it, nor can it be valued in pure gold. Wisdom, the book of Proverbs points out this over and over again. It's invaluable. You can't put a price tag on it. It's worth more than all the gold in this world. And so you can't value it. Verse 13 and then again in 21 through 22, man does not know its value, nor is it found in the land of the living. In fact, 21, it's hidden from the eyes of all living and concealed from the birds of the air. Destruction and death say, we've heard a report about it with our ears. And the point seems to be that it's not found in man, not inherently within man. It doesn't originate with man. We might say, I've heard about it, but it doesn't originate with us. So, where's wisdom found? Can't search and find it. Can't purchase it. It's not found in man. Well, why not? Verse 23 through 27. Where does it belong? Who knows about it? God knows. He knows its place. He looks to the ends of the earth and sees under the whole heavens, to establish a weight for the wind and apportion the measure by water. When he made a law for the rain and made a path for the thunderbolt, then he saw wisdom and declared it. He prepared it. Indeed, he searched it out. And the point just seems to be that wisdom comes from God, and you can see that wisdom even how the earth operates. You see God's wisdom in that. So, here's the conclusion. Get your pencil out, your highlighter out, whatever you use, and highlight it. And this is what he says. Behold, the fear of the Lord, what? That is wisdom. And to depart from evil is understanding. What is wisdom? It's to fear God. It's to serve him. How many times does the book of Proverbs make a point very similar to that when it is talking about an exalting wisdom? It reminds me in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 6, God told the people of Israel, you go into the land of Israel, you be careful to observe all these commandments, for this is your wisdom in the sight of all the people. And when they will hear all these statutes, and they will say, surely this is a wise and understanding people. Why? They're following God. Sometimes we look at somebody and we say, you know what, they're wise. No, they've got the wisdom of God. They've learned to fear God. I guess in that sense they are wise. But the point is, it's not anything that what? Originates with them. It's not anything that's been obtained by their age or by their intellect. True wisdom is what? It's a gift from God. It's fearing the Lord. It's doing things God's way. And so Job here, I think, if it is related directly to the friends, and it's a continuation of the speech, I think Job is telling his friends, you think you've got the market on wisdom cornered. You think you're smarter than everybody else. Let me tell you, wisdom didn't come from you. Wisdom comes from God. That's where it came from. And fearing God, that's what true wisdom is. And Job, in essence, is saying, that's what I've been doing, what? All along. Let's stop right there in a few minutes here, and we may get started back if we need to. But we've gone through Job's speech in chapter 24 and on through Bildad and then Job's response. What practical lessons do you learn as you go through this section about suffering, about dealing with others, about responding? Anything you learn in these chapters?
You can't figure it out. Sometimes you have to trust God.
Okay. I think ultimately that the big picture of the book of Job, and you're already seeing sort of some shadows of that, is you're never going to figure everything out. You know, when we finish here, we're going into the book of Ecclesiastes. When we finish the book of Job, and you know, the wise man Solomon pointed out in terms of trying to pursuit of human wisdom and trying to figure everything out. He said it's an exhausting task, and we'll never figure it out. I mean, if you sit in life and you try to figure out, I wonder why that happened to that person, and it didn't happen over here. Or why is this happening to, you know what's going to happen? You're going to become frustrated. You'll never understand it all. The only thing you really have to understand is what? God's in control. God knows where to put your trust in him. Let's see something.
Chapter 23, just a reminder that, you know, sometimes we look and we say, he's not here, he's not listening to me, I can't find him, where is he?
Yeah.
In my case, life's not fair, but he is there, and he does know, and he cares for us, no matter if we can't physically see with our eyes, we see evidence of him that we talk about.
Right.
He knows what we're going through, and
Right. God was there all along. I've said many times, the question in the book of Job is never where is God when Job is suffering. The question is where is Job when Job is suffering. And that's really the question. God is in control. And just because he doesn't respond in the way we want or respond immediately doesn't mean he is not listening and he is not there. But probably most people that have gone through much suffering in life have probably felt much like Job has at some point in time, where you just wonder, maybe it is just for a moment. Maybe it's just a fleeting thought in your mind to think, what? Where's the Lord? Why isn't he doing something? Why isn't he responding? And so that, Job, it's easy to sort of be critical of him, but I think most of us probably have allowed that fleeting thought at least to go through our mind. Maybe for some it's lingered more than that. What else do we learn? I think we learn sometimes in dealing with others that they don't want to, they do not listen and respond to what we're saying. And what I mean by that is, and I've had religious discussions like this, where you present maybe in a Bible class, you present all kinds of passages about baptism, and somebody comes back and they don't touch top side or bottom on that. They talk about a passage about faith. And the point may be much like Job's friends, you know what? Amen. But they're not touching on what I'm saying. Sometimes in discussions, we'll talk over one another, so talking to one another, and instead of responding to what the other is saying, we're just wanting to make our point. I think you see that in Job's friends, and really what you see in them is nothing new. It's the same way that discussions take place oftentimes today, religiously, sometimes politically. Or I think, you ever seen in a political debate, somebody will make a point, and then they'll give the person to, they'll say, what about his position on taxes? And he said this, and then they give an opportunity to respond, and then he goes off on some tangent on some completely other topic, as opposed to answering the question. It's a diversionary tactic when, in essence, you know what that tells me about that politician? He didn't have an answer to give. And in religious discussions, whether it's like Job and his three friends, and somebody avoids it, it tells me they can't what? They can't answer it. They're trying to divert us to continue. You know what Job does? He continues to come back time and again to the same points. And it's like Job says, until you answer these what? We're not moving on. There's some wisdom in how Job finally approaches things in those sections. What else do you learn? Yeah, just keep going. I think sometimes we learn that we can hold, and I've mentioned this before, we can hold to a true biblical principle, and we can make misapplication of that principle if we're not careful. Like the reap what you sow principle, that I believe very firmly is a principle found in Scripture, yet we can't take that what? And every time something bad happens to somebody. So sometimes you can hold to a true biblical principle, and yet that when it's applied, that principle is what? It's misapplied. It's not applied in the correct manner. And again, only God really has the full answer to everything. Only God fully understands. And that's where wisdom is found. And what I have to learn to do is to fear and to trust. One thing I said that I remember the very first time, I think I said this when we started the book of Job. I'd heard my whole life, what is the book of Job about? And somebody says about why the righteous suffer. And I remember I was a 19-year-old preacher moving into Alabama and going to teach my first Bible book. And I said, what are we teaching on Wednesday night? And they say, it's the book of Job. And I thought, well, let's start out easy here. But, I remember thinking as I started, I was just so excited that I'd finally really sit down and study and I'd get an answer to what? Why the righteous suffer. And the reality is, there is not an answer given to that in the book of Job. And I've really quit a long time ago assigning that as the theme of the book of Job. The book of Job is not about why the righteous suffer, so that when something's going wrong in your life, I say, here, Ben, let me tell you. Here's the book of Job says this is why. No, it doesn't give us that. What the book of Job says is you just trust the Lord no matter what. You put your trust in Him because He's more powerful, He's wiser, He's smarter than what we are. And therefore, what I have to learn in times of suffering is not to try to overanalyze everything as to why, but just trust the Lord that what? He knows what He's doing, to learn whatever lessons I can learn from that and to try to be stronger. But there is not one answer to be given as to the question of why righteous people suffer. We're going to barely get started here, and as I said, unfortunately, it will be, I guess, 4 weeks before we're back into the book of Job. But Job's final declaration, before we're going to be introduced to a fourth friend by the name of Eliphaz, who has issues with Job and his three friends. Eliphaz is in some ways, in my mind, a cut above the other friends, but we'll talk about that later. You know, oftentimes in times of suffering, you know what we talk about? All the good old days. Now, let me just say this. I think the Bible warns about that. I think the Bible warns about that in the book of Ecclesiastes. And one reason I think the Bible warns about that is, you ever heard somebody say hindsight's 20/20? It ain't right. That's incorrect. Oftentimes when we look back, we filter out and we don't remember the bad things, we only remember the good things. You know, you think about the people of Israel. They come out of Egyptian bondage and they're complaining and they say, oh, the flesh pots and the onions, or the leeks, and all the food was so good. You know what they didn't recall? They didn't talk about the bondage and the killing of their kids and all of those kind of things. Oftentimes when we look back, we remember only the good and we filter out the bad, and we always think, oh, those days were so much better than what they are right now. Hindsight very rarely is 20/20. It's often a very distorted view of things. But Job looks back and he talks about his days prior to this current suffering. And he said, oh, that I were in the months past and the days when God watched. Wished I could go back, in time to the previous days. What were those days like? Well, this is what he said. God blessed me. The light shone on my head. I was in my prime. The friendly counsel of God was over my tent. The Almighty was with me. I wished I could go back to those days when God blessed me, and as opposed to where I am right now. I wished I could go back to the days when I was respected by the people, verses 7 to 11. I went to the gate of the city, and I took my seat in the open square, and the young men saw me and hid, and the aged arose and stood. It's a description of respect that the younger people thought, you know what, he's not worthy for us, to be in his presence. And everybody else stood and treated him with respect. The princes refrained from talking and put their hand over their mouth, and the voice of nobles was hushed, and their tongue stuck to the roof of their mouth. When the ear heard, that it blessed me. When the eye saw, then it approved of me. The point seems to be, there was a time in life in which people couldn't wait to see me. They respected me. The young, the old, the powerful, they knew who Job was. They respected his character. Job said, I wish I could go back to that day. And I understand, you understand where Job's coming from right now. I mean, that he's looking back and he's thinking, you know what, I could go back to those days. Those were much better days. Those are the good old days. Well, we'll pick up there in our study. We'll review back from the first few verses of chapter 29. And again, next week, Brother Joe's going to teach on, you'll ask him. I don't know. But it won't be the book of Job, and then we'll pick up with that when I